It's Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m. in Switzerland. It's Space Café WebTalk time. Our Space Café WebTalk, 33 minutes with Dr. Regina Peldszus and Marc Becker will begin soon. Thank you for joining us for this exciting and very unique event. We know we will have a very informed audience for this event on space, a dual-use future. As always, we appreciate your participation and your ongoing feedback. I'm Thorsten Kriening, your host today and publisher of SpaceWatch.Global. We are a Switzerland-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. I know many of you already are familiar with our website, bi-weekly newsletter, our daily newsletter, and the Space Café podcast. Our bi-weekly newsletter number 119 will be published this Thursday, so be on the lookout. We are also proud to announce that last week we published episode 4 of our podcast featuring Roxy Gülmeister from Foster & Partners discussing life after COVID in space and on Earth. Check it out and leave us your comments at podcast@spacewatch.global. We are keen to get your feedback and your ratings, of course. If you have missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our web page on the event section. We host our Space Café web talks on a weekly basis. As you know, this is already the 12th edition. Time is running when you have fun. I hope you mark Tuesdays at the same time in your calendars. As we are talking about space in our work environment day by day, next slide, please, production. Thank you. It is worth to mention that today marks the 57th anniversary of Valentina Tereshkova's flight on Vostok 6. 16th of June 1963 was the day the first woman went to space. As we actively promote equality, I think Valentina's message comes in very clear. A bird cannot fly with only one wing, and human spaceflight cannot develop any further without the active participation of women. A strong sentence we all have to keep in mind. Today, I'm very honored to be joined by two guests, by two super gender balanced and very special guests. This is very new for the show and a nice challenge for me. Dr. Regina Peldszus is a senior policy officer with the German space agency, DLR Space Administration, Department of Space Situational Awareness. She focuses on European and multilateral collaboration and handles studies on emerging issues at the intersection of space security operations and infrastructure. Prior to joining DLR, Regina was an internal research fellow with ESA at the European Space Operations Center's Studies and Special Project Division, focusing on mission control during critical phases such as launch and early orbit operations. Regina holds an PhD from Kingston University London on the future space mission scenarios. Her interests include resilience, foresight, and governance of complex systems in high reliable domains. Super interesting interest. Others just have reading or singing as hobby. Marc Becker is also a policy officer in the Department of Space Situational Awareness at the DLR Space Administration, but he focuses on the security aspects of SSA and works in particular on policy and security requirements for the handling and sharing of SSA data in bilateral and multilateral settings. Prior to joining DLR, Marc worked with the German Ministry of Defense, the Directorate General for Security and Defense Policy, as a desk officer for space security policy. He holds a Master of International Affairs with a focus on international security and technology from the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. So I'm very proud to welcome Dr. Regina Peldszus and Marc Becker today.
Hi, Thorsten.
Hello. And for all you listening to us, I think that makes sense why we have both of them here in the show, as they are working in the same field with different angles. And so let us start our conversation. Regina, may I ask you to lead us into the concept of dual use? And Marc, if you would like to continue with a view on application. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Torsten, for your introduction and also for having us here today to discuss dual use. We're delighted to be here. And the reason we turned up together with Marc, is we're colleagues and we work in an inherently dual use domain, which is space situational awareness. And specifically, we work on a multilateral initiative called European Union Space Surveillance and Tracking, which is a civilian program, but there's a military and a security dimension that we have to take into account. And in our everyday work, we address this exact intersection and interaction between the two sides. So we want to take the opportunity this afternoon to unpack and disentangle the idea and the concept of dual use a little bit, especially because we believe that it will continue to be a defining feature of how we utilize space as a community in the future. And to this end, we want to give you some food for thought from the conceptual side on the idea, and then also in terms of application. And I'd like to start off with 2 points. On the one hand, the meaning of dual use, what it is, and how we use it, and then also how our perspective on it has changed over the past decades, really. So as a general notion, the term dual use denotes the potential or the ability of a system or a technology to serve both military and civilian purposes. And for the space domain in particular, this refers to really fundamental technologies such as launchers and many types of payloads for different applications. And in practice, this entails that the lines are quite blurred, and that a distinction of whether a satellite, for instance, is military or civilian can rarely be made purely on the basis of the technology or the components used per se, but rather on who the specific user or the utilization of the system or the mission is. So this means, for instance, that you can have one single system which is serving two communities, civilian and military, and at the same time you can also have two separate systems for both communities, but the systems look and behave very much similarly in terms of technology and operations. And therefore we often say, or we take it for granted, I think in the space community, that space technology is dual use, and that's an intrinsic or a characteristic feature of this type of technology. And this has been pretty much a constant throughout the history of spaceflight so far. And however, the way we frame and use and make use of this concept and this idea has really changed significantly, particularly in the last few decades. So during the Cold War, initially, the aspect of dual use of space technologies, most notably missiles, of course, was primarily seen in the context of arms control, non-proliferation. So essentially, if you were a government actor or a state actor, you wouldn't want to pass on defense technology to your adversaries. And in that context, you also needed to regulate technology that you were exchanging with your partners, and that was subject to export control regimes. So we're thinking of ITAR here, for instance, the International Traffic in Arms Regulation. And for a long time, dual use as a concept was really seen through this lens of export control. However, this really changed after the Cold War, and especially in Europe. And today, we don't necessarily see dual use so much as a problem or a hindrance, or an obstacle that we have to overcome in terms of collaboration, for instance, but we see it as an opportunity, or it's posited and framed as an opportunity and a feature of space technology which we can exploit and use and cultivate in the sense of different systems being multi-purpose or synergetic, if you will. So when, for instance, you have an industrial base or an industrial ecosystem, and sector, you don't maintain two different branches of aerospace and defense, but you basically explore and exploit the commonalities. So dual use is, as a concept and an idea, has always been there, and it continues to be here. But my point is really the way we have used this and framed it has changed today from an arms control headache, if you will, to a desirable property. And this really goes for a wide range of applications, and my colleague Marc's going to go into this in a little bit more detail.
Thanks, Regina, and thanks, Torsten, for having us. So I'd really like to highlight a few examples on the application side where dual use aspects have really evolved in recent years, and we're likely to continue to do so in the future. So space technology hasn't always have that dual use potential. A lot of that potential was actually used or put in practice since the very beginning of the space age. And since during the Cold War, the vast majority of space systems were operated by states, there are lots of examples of military and non-military applications of the same systems. But even non-military uses at the time, in essence, meant governmental use. So obviously this is changing today as space actors are becoming much more diverse. We've seen a lot of non-state actors enter the domain along with the surge in commercial activities in recent years. And it's quite interesting to see how dual use is now being applied across sectors and really across the board in different fields of applications, such as Earth observation, communication, or navigation. Take, for instance, high-resolution satellite imagery that used to be available only for the most sophisticated militaries and intelligence services in the world. A lot of that data is now available for purchase or even for free, such as from the EU's Copernicus program. And scientists use that imagery to study climate change or open source investigations, even discovered previously unknown parts of the Iranian missile program. But of course, also military users increasingly look into buying imagery from commercial providers, be it because they lack own capabilities or, and this is cheaper maybe than building your own reconnaissance satellites, or because they want to increase resilience by adding more sources and filling potential gaps in geographic coverage. So military providers may end up selling the exact same images to both civil and military customers. And the software algorithm that can track changes of the environment or look at the levels of oil tanks, how much they're filled, for instance. That same algorithm may be able to track movements of troops or military equipment as well.
Do you have examples for that, Marc, today already? So is Maxar selling their same pictures to the military and to commercial?
At least there's now a discussion going on in the US in how far you can still regulate commercial satellite imagery at this point, because if the same images are available in different countries as well from other commercial providers, it doesn't make a lot of sense to regulate that specific kind of images. So right now, arms control and export control in that area is more moving towards regulating what is really unique in a certain market.
If we stick for the moment on the Earth observation or a market you pointed out, is there a parameter to set where dual use or where military or intelligence use starts and where commercial starts? I mean, Planet just lowered their satellites or in the altitude to come up with 50 centimeter resolution. What I think is quite cool already. So,
sure. I mean, you can obviously, if you have if you're an intelligence service, you might be interested in even higher resolution. But the resolution that is commercially available today, that's enough to do many cool stuff, actually, like the Iranian plant that was previously unknown to also the intelligence world, most probably, that was discovered by a civilian university, by a research institute. So that's one of the areas where it certainly makes sense. And it illustrates why it's so difficult to regulate this aspect of dual use. And on the other hand, it also shows why so many diverse actors move in this field now. Because for a provider, it might make a good business model to serve customers from different sectors. It might be efficient in terms of costs and resources. And in the view of government and militaries, it might be a suitable way to buy also commercial images for enhancing mission assurance, exploiting synergies across the sectors, and putting a whole of government approach to space security and space safety into practice. So we can really look at this similar aspects in different fields such as SSA and space surveillance and tracking, which is where Regina and I work, or other emerging technologies such as active debris removal or on-orbit servicing, And that's where we really need some kind of capability to conduct rendezvous and proximity operations, including approaching, inspecting, repairing, and potentially manipulating, of course, another space object. And that's where we often have those discussions that this is not only a dual-use system in the sense of being useful for military operations or supporting military operations in other domains potentially, but that robotic technologies like these could itself be used as a capability that can be weaponized eventually. So that's another interesting field. I think we're happy to delve into some of these questions in the Q&A.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, it's a super entry, and I've seen that we have two top level specialists in this field already are in our audience. So and just to name them, Jessica West from Canada and Victoria Sampson from the Secure World Foundation are notable experts on RPO and many other things. So a warm welcome from our end. So, but coming back to both of you, as you're my guests today. So you both work in the field of SSA, or as we elaborated a bit earlier. Let me ask in particular, what is the dual-use aspect of SSA that to get an understanding? Marc, if you don't mind.
Sure. So space situational awareness is, first of all, the ability to know what's going on in space. So it includes, of course, space weather and near-Earth objects as well. But it also includes the tracking of artificial objects in space, in orbit, so active satellite and debris objects. And since we know that any collision up there can really have catastrophic effects because of the sheer speed and orbital dynamics, we need to constantly track those objects and monitor them in order to keep our critical space infrastructure safe. And that includes systems like Galileo and GPS for navigation, for instance, but also other military or civil communication satellites, for instance, that are really critical for our everyday life now. And that's one of the inherent dual-use dimensions. And of course, if you can track space debris, you can also track with the same technology missiles, for instance, or movements of military satellites that some states would prefer not to disclose, for instance. And actually, a lot of the technology that we use to track those objects in space originally stem from the missile defense field and missile defense radars. And many of these radars continue to be operated by military actors today. In fact, the US military is the biggest provider of SSA data, and that data is used by civil operators of satellites globally.
Okay. Let's speed up a bit in our conversation. You both are civilians, at least are here today, and I think also in real life. How do you interact with stakeholders from the security side in your everyday work? How can we envision that?
So in our everyday work, usually both Marc and I are delegates in different decision-making bodies of this multilateral infrastructure of SSA sensors that we operate together with other member states in Europe. And that really, on an everyday level, this entails working, debating, talking, drafting together with military colleagues. Primarily, I mean, it's a civilian program that we work on, but we have a lot of stakeholders who either operate sensor systems jointly or separately from us, like all the different member states are different in there as well. And the interactions are really on all kinds of levels. So we are in the working level, then the operations level, in the actual ops centers working together. It's often staffed by military and civilians together in the analysis and in the operations part. Then we have the different decision-making and governance bodies that we have in Europe for this type of issue, and there the militaries and the civilian space agencies, for instance, have to talk a lot to each other because nobody can do it alone. It's such a huge investment in this type of sensors. And then if you go on the higher level, even for different state actors working together, you always have these direct interactions, hopefully, and a very strong dialogue between different ministries of defense, ministries of research or economy, whoever deals with space in your country. So there's collaboration and exchange, and often, you know, reconciliation of interests, because they're not always the same, of course, on all of these levels.
Okay, got it. So my impression is you have to leave your mobile and all your electronic devices outside and then go in, and you can't talk about what you do actually to your friends and your neighbors. So is that does it describe or
No.
no?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think to some degree, I mean, of course, I mean, if you work in this domain, there are instances where you do exactly that. And I think many of our audience will maybe already be exposed to this or have been exposed to this in the past. But I think I just saw a question in the bottom regarding classification, and that really resonates with that a little bit. And so we need to take into account different restrictions that currently exist, for better or worse, and classification. Maybe Marc, you can say a little bit about how you work with that.
Yeah, sure. And Christian, who posed the question, is exactly right to point out that, of course, it's difficult to hide something in space if considering the technologies of tracking, so sensors for tracking like radars and telescopes really proliferate and are now operated by a number of states and also even commercial actors. But when we work on a multilateral level in a European framework to share SSA data and really make sense of that data, really figure out basically a real-time model where a certain object will be in the next few days, and if it comes close to any other object, for instance, it's difficult to keep some data out of that because of classification issues. But they do still exist. So this is an evaluation, if you will. Militaries gradually start to put or disclose some of their Keplerian elements or TLE data of their satellites in order to keep space safe for all, because after all, if there's a huge event and this will hurt anyone, and so this is definitely an interesting field that we work on at the moment. Yeah.
Marc, one question also coming from the audience here. Please give good examples of how small states in Europe are using this dual-use space technology, if you can.
I mean, it's certainly the case that a few smaller states in Europe are really good in specializing in certain aspects that are really of interest to them, such as the Nordic countries, Finland, for instance, that really focus on small satellites that collect data that can be used for monitoring environmental issues, for instance. But of course, that's the whole point of dual use. It really depends on what you use the data for. So,
so you're referring to the ISI satellites?
I mean, for example, so there's different applications, and it's interesting, of course, for especially the smaller member states to really go into some niches that are particularly interesting for them generally, and then develop capabilities in that realm. And in a field like SSA, we really start pooling and sharing all the data that we have, because we realize in Europe, if we want to take something of the global burden sharing in SSA and keep that domain safe for everyone, we need to share all of our efforts, and together we are stronger in that sense.
Good. Chaitanya's question I would like to have here, with the heavy commercialization of space technology and exploration, how could governments regulate dual-use aspects of commercially or conceived technologies in the future against commercial interest? Who would like to jump on that?
I think I'm going to jump on this. I think it's a super interesting tangent, or let's say when we look at this binary concept of military civilian, we see this often as two different things, and we often say, okay, commercialization is another trend. Of course, it's a fundamental paradigm shift, and at the same time, we often in our discussions we seem to place it in the civilian corner. Okay, the commercial aspects, the democratization of space, more actors, more diverse actors, more companies, and so forth. But I think what's really interesting in that, encapsulated in that question, is that is commercial, can we really map it onto one of those fields, or is it really in the middle? Because of course we have a huge number of commercial actors who are active in the military domain as contractors or subcontractors, for instance, for most of the military capabilities that we operate, or at least there's some kind of development and interaction going on. So I think this question of how we deal with the commercial side, and commercial, I really mean this very broad spectrum of anything from satellite operators to systems integrators to commercial users of certain products, because industry itself is a diverse thing and not just one group. I think this is going to be really interesting in the future, and I think we're going to see a lot of cross-pollination. We're going to see a lot of business cases that traditionally explore both sides, because of course, if you have one technology that you can use, why not use it for two purposes? And the question is, how do we want to govern this in the future? And how do we want to, what kind of system do we want to see in the future in that sense?
Another interesting question came in from Sayat, if I pronounce it in the right way. Is the main goal of SSA to prevent militarization of space or to serve long-term sustainability? Marc?
I mean, it's really about, first of all, knowing what's going on, and for a lot of applications, be it managing all that increase in civil and commercial traffic that we see with large constellations that are being launched as we speak, you cannot operate safely if you don't know your environment. So this is one aspect, but of course, military actors, they also want to know what's going on in space, because, for instance, this is just one example, you need to be aware of space weather effects that, for example, can impact how precise navigation works at a given point in time. So of course, this is very relevant to militaries that are, for example, on missions abroad. They need to know if there's any impact from space. So this is why SSA really serves a lot of different purposes, not directly linked to any militarization.
Okay. As we are running almost out of time, and I know already 33 minutes are running like the wind, there's one final question I would like to ask primarily Regina. We promoted this event with this question, can space technology be neutral? What are your thoughts on that? Is there any neutrality?
So I think what's interesting in this context is to revisit, if you think about dual use as in the history of technology or the philosophy of technology, it's there's something that we can look into, which is the Kranzberg laws of technology, which are a number of sentences or truths in the sense of about technology, and one of them is that technology is neither bad nor good, nor is it neutral. So I think this is it's almost a little bit of a cryptic thing to say. It's a cryptic dictum, but on the other hand, I think it gives us a lot of agency in terms of thinking about what we actually want to do with the technology that we put in place and that we design. Because it's true that often we say this type of camera or this type of sensor is neutral. Of course, it's neutral, it doesn't do anything right there, but as soon as we use it in a certain way, as soon as we write certain requirements, we're already bifurcating, and as soon as we formulate it or articulate it as a capability, certainly it's not neutral anymore, unless you again say it's for both purposes. So I'm sure there are some missions that are completely very clearly unambiguous unless you hack them in a way or you use them for something else or you appropriate. But I don't think technology is neutral, but I guess the jury is out, and it's a great way of thinking about the systems that we currently set up for ourselves for the future.
It reminds me a bit on our few of the presentations I heard from Victoria over the last years about behaviors in space, and that it will be the new norm. Yeah. So let's see where that will lead us to. Marc, some final words from your end on that topic.
Well, I agree. So it's certainly interesting we really highlighted, I think, how dual use is difficult to regulate. So it's very natural to start looking more into the actual behavior, and that's where SSA comes in again, because of course you need to know what's going on and have some independent data sources to be able to actually make a judgment on whether some activity in orbit is acceptable normatively or not. So
great. Thank you very much. And I'm afraid we have to come to an end, but thanks for joining me for this Space Cafe here.
Pleasure.
But to all of you, be sure we will follow up with space security topics on future Space Cafe web talks and in our magazines. Two very special events we planned for you are this Thursday. So really in, in 48 hours, on the 18th or at 5 p.m. So 1 hour later than we usually start, together with Professor Michel Henlon from For All Moonkind. We plan this event on equality and civil rights due to the current situation. This is a very unique event, and if you're interested, then especially where we are talking about the American point of view, or they talk, I have to say I'm not actively participating, so they will talk or she will talk about the American point of view. Please register now, as we are expecting really a full house. And if you can't join on Zoom, then we have to guide you to Facebook Live, but then it's not interactive. And the other one will be very special edition with our 33 minutes on the Asteroid Day. And what is our UN Asteroid Day on the 30th of June in the morning with Michael Küppers. He's a mission specialist at the Hera mission from ESA, and this event will be hosted by the voice of our Space Cafe podcast, Markus Moslechner. And on top of that, next slide, please, production. Our next webinars are on the 23rd. I will welcome Jessie K. Chingler from the Open Lunar Foundation to talk with her about lunar policy issues, including safety zones. And I mean, all what we talk today about our dual use, I mean, will apply for the moon and anything in between Earth and moon as well. I mean, that's something really foreseeable. And on the 30th of June, I will discuss with Dr. Bladen Bone about his new book, War in Space, Strategies, Superpowers and Geopolitics. And he got really high ratings for his book already by top-level people in the industry. And on the 7th of July, and that's the first-hand announcement, if you haven't got your message from Eventbrite already, Sebastian Moranta from the European Space Policy Institute in Vienna will be my guest, and to have a chat with him about the European space industry after COVID-19, as they just conducted a big study on that. Super exciting for all of us in the industry, I guess, and super important to see it going on. All events are online on Eventbrite. As always, we would like to hear your feedback, so please check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up to our daily or to our bi-weekly newsletter. We really need your support. So also, if as a potential sponsor of this WebTalk, please get in touch with us, or if you have an interest. And thank you all very much for your interest today. And thank you again, Marc and Regina and Marc, for your exciting talk and being my guest. And sorry that it's just that short. And thanks again to the entire team behind the scenes for doing this great job week by week again. I hope you all... Thank you. My pleasure. I hope you all will stay safe and stay healthy. And thanks for joining us. I hope to see you next week, or no, later this week and next week. In the meantime, visit our website and follow us on social media. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye. Thank you, Thorsten.
Thank you.